Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Julie Crooks, Curator, Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the AGO operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat Confederacies. Today's talk continues the programming related to Fragments of Epic Memory, which situates historical vernacular photography from the Caribbean in dialogue with modern and contemporary Caribbean artists from the region and its diaspora. We're grateful for the generous support of our sponsors and donors who helped make the exhibition possible, although the exhibition is now closed for a couple of weeks due to the unfortunate circumstances of COVID, but we hope that it will reopen very soon before it closes on February 21st. A reminder to ask questions towards the end of the talk using Zoom's Q&A function. I want to really thank both Leasho and O'Neill for joining us and look forward to a most compelling and generative conversation. By way of introduction, Leasho Johnson is a visual artist working in painting, collage, sculpture, and some digital media. He was born in Montego Bay, but raised in Sheffield, a small town on the outskirts of Negril, Jamaica. Johnson uses his experience growing up Black and queer to explore concepts around forming identity and identity within the post-colonial condition. Johnson was a 2021 Leslie Lohman Fellow and graduated with an MFA in painting from the School of Art Institute, Chicago in 2020. An artist, curator, researcher, and writer, O'Neill Lawrence has worked at the National Gallery of Jamaica in various capacities since 2008, most recently as its chief curator. His photography and video work have been included in several international exhibitions, and his research interests include race, gender, and sexuality in the Caribbean and African diasporal art and visual culture, memory, identity, and hidden archives, photography as a medium, and a social vehicle. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So I'm thinking, Leasho, you had I'm not sure if you want to start with your presentation because I actually have quite a few questions about that, but I think to contextualize it, it might work better if people had the visuals.
Okay, sure. Okay. You're hearing me, right?
Yes.
Okay. I guess should I go through everything and then we kind of come back, or?
I don't know, whichever you feel more comfortable, because the thing is I can, do whichever you feel more comfortable, because I could just start with the questions and then we go through.
Yeah, I think the questions will be nice.
Okay, all right, no problem. It's very interesting for me that in the exhibition, Fragments of Epic Memory are represented with two works to the Sweet Sugar Cane, those two works, and you're also represented with Jawbone, Man Looking Back at the Cane Fields. And for me, it feels as if those two works act as almost bookends to quite a lot of development that's happened within your career, within the way you've used similar elements and the way those elements have evolved, the way you have evolved as an artist. I'm actually thinking a little bit to kind of start with why you said the earlier works, I think these are 2013, why you decided to utilize these comical figures and what role they play in the dialogue you're trying to have with your audience.
I mean, how do I start? Well, the first thing I wanted to kind of think about is space. And that is something I find very, very, it kind of comes up in my head a lot here, especially being in the Caribbean. Like, we're very, very sensitive as it relates to where things and people come from. If it's food, we know where it comes from, and if it's, you know, people who came from. But it's just kind of like negotiation is understanding of who belongs where. And I think for me in particular, trying to navigate my own gender and my own sexuality, it became a question as to where am I and where am I placed and where am I located in these contexts, whether it's, you know, something that has to do with slavery, or, you know, or does it have to do with crops? And so for me, you know, thinking about like living here, there's a lot of information that are only embedded in the objects. They're only embedded in the day-to-day. They're only embedded in, you know, the history as it relates to the crops that are grown here, like sugarcane and stuff like that. And the dialogues that are being shared through, like, you know, the history of the Caribbean, they tend to be, I find them to be misconstruing, and they don't reveal the whole thing. So I find if I needed to locate myself in these histories and in these objects, I had to, you know, kind of become my own investigator. And, you know, visualities is kind of like my own tool. So thinking about language, how certain things exist when it's represented visually. So caricature, the power and the device of caricature, juxtaposing that with the painted image. And, you know, where does a painted image sits in our history, and where does the comical sit in our history, like that. And then, of course, how we kind of navigate our space using satire and using jokes and kind of using these things as coping mechanisms, as hiding kind of these innuendos and these thoughts, these sometimes dark thoughts are, you know, sometimes they manifest themselves in a very morbid way, even though it's supposed to be sexual, kind of like these weird kind of in-between spaces. That's kind of like what the work kind of seeks to locate.
But one of the things I have been wondering about, there's a bit of a, well, not more so of a statement that you made with regards to a later work, Cocktails and Pum Pum, which you did in, that's 2017, where you were talking about Caribbean history as a product of colonial commerce.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing that I found, particularly with this installation, I mean, there were so many different issues that you were addressing with this particular piece, but there is the aspect for me that I think was very, I'd say, poignant and very prominent, well, in a variety of ways you could look at, was the issue surrounding sexual tourism. Yeah. So going back to commerce, back to the body, back to the commercialization and the kind of connections with how the Black body has been marginalized, exoticized, the way it has been commercialized. Is that something that you think is necessary as a dialogue to be having within the Caribbean and about the Caribbean?
I mean, most definitely. I think more than anything else, most Caribbean folks I've discovered have been struggling with kind of understanding self-worth and self-value. And this is then, then kind of juxtaposed with certain things like sun, sea, and sand, and I'm talking about on an individual, as in how can you kind of autonomize your own will and your own passions and your own desires in a space that's kind of just cultivated, or kind of even your kind of you being here is a reflection of that commerce, but then of course how how do you construct identity around these things? That's kind of been one of those things that I've been investigating for a while. And I mean, most of my older works I find have always been kind of talking about an outside space. Like, it's a broad kind of social commentary versus kind of being something open. But yes, I mean, how do you then justify daggering? How do you justify someone doing things like that to themselves? And how do you talk about tourism when someone, a male probably, finds himself to be in a particular space, an object of desire when he's on the beach versus say being back home with his family. These kind of mind spaces, these kind of behaviors, these kind of identities that we kind of jump in and out of was kind of like part of the exercise or part of the exploration I find, thinking about commodification, thinking about objects, thinking about, things that you drink, things that you eat, and how that's kind of related to your body. Kind of like the Josephine Baker stereotypes, just like how, we fit into all of these things. And then how do you find yourself kind of being seen as an individual as opposed to be a destination?
It's interesting because I mean, I'm looking back at the work and almost reliving it as we're looking at it on the screen and thinking about my eyes are really focused on the dead fish that's kind of in the center of the screen. And I'm actually thinking about the way, the way that the term fish is referring to specifically gay men in Jamaican society. I'm not sure if it's wider Caribbean, but definitely in Jamaican society. But I'm also thinking about the kind of interweaving of homophobia and sexual tourism. There is a bit of a quote that I read the article recently by Edward Akintola Hubbard. It's called Britain Can't Just Reverse the Homophobia It Exported During Empire. And there's one quote that he had in it where he said homophobia is also a highly effective way for the encouragement of, I'm paraphrasing, of crypto economy, of sexual tourism in the Caribbean to capitalize on the idea of toxic hypermasculinity. So in breaking down and tearing down anything that is seen as the effeminate male, then it's almost like it's doing the reverse in hyping, in exposing, in promoting the hyper masculine, because the Caribbean is not a space that will tolerate particular ways of behavior, ways of being. Then so therefore, it's inviting you to experience the hyper masculine and the hyper masculinist attitudes. So it's for me, that is something that I think is very important, that's not often or not discussed enough. And that's one of the things that you have been exploring very, very openly with your work. Why do you feel it? I mean, why do you feel so comfortable with having this conversation within? Yeah, I know, within the Jamaican context, because this work existed in a white box space, obviously, in what I usually call the safe platform of a museum. But you also had a similar work done in a public space. So why do you feel it's like you took the work outside of the space to have more people have the conversation? Why did you feel you needed to have that with the wider public?
Well, I mean, as I had said before in the beginning, it's about negotiating space. So I was trying to find a tolerance level, because I think for me, kind of growing, coming to age in the 90s, this thing didn't really exist, or it did exist, but it was kind of like an abstract thing until it came on media and film and stuff like that, and then it became more mainstream during that period of time. So for me, there was almost like this psychic connection. I'm trying to sense or test to see how much Jamaicans have come to tolerate it, and it's just that I think for me, there's certain things started changing, so such as the wearing of tight jeans and like men who are very, very fashionable. Like these kind of cultural shifts that I'm like, oh, probably there is these things that people are assessing themselves. Probably people are becoming more conscious, are more open in some levels. So the work, it's kind of like a twofold thing where I'm using this very unrealistic, very caricature-esque kind of, the character itself becomes like almost like a avatar that talks about that kind of represents a kind of consciousness. It's playing on, it's supposed to be funny, it's not supposed to be serious. So whenever it does something that may be queer, it's kind of then people approach it much more open-mindedly, with a kind of tongue-in-cheek. That was kind of like the thought. And so when I did it on the street, it was just kind of like, how are people going to react? Is it that they're going to be open-minded about it or not? And I think most of I'd say the first decade of my practice have been a kind of about trickling these, slowly tweaking it more and more to make it seem a little bit more queer. I didn't think I was being brave, or I didn't think like it was, to me, it was unintentional. It was just kind of like to serve or to kind of talk about something that in a medium that's not being talked about. And I thought, with how I was working, helps to kind of make it much more accessible to people. And it's even through that, then it became kind of dual in terms of thinking about the white space and the street space. Yeah, I mean, and I, it's very like I do it thoughtfully. I'm not just like there's a kind of measure, there's a kind of precaution how I construct the images and what's revealed and what's not revealed. And the simplicity of it, it just needed to kind of have an opening, but it's very, very self-conscious and very aware of its surroundings.
I've always found the characters that you used to be very I've often, from the very first time I saw them, I considered them to be quite subversive, because they're abstracted versions of hypersexuality, both male and female, but then they are borderline offensive, but definitely a bit humorous in terms of the way that they're presented. And it for me, it always reminds me of the Jamaican saying, we take serious thing, make joke, it's like we're taking something that's very serious and making fun of it. But in making fun of it, you're enabling the conversation. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I found always kind of, it's almost like with that element of your work acted as an entry point for the difficult conversations or the challenging conversations, because people are drawn in, and it's after they're drawn in by the humor, by the the way it's so carefully constructed, then they actually have to start thinking more about what it is they're really looking at. Yeah. And I found that very interesting with this in both this space and the Hope Road iteration. I don't know if you can show that slide, but in terms of how the work, or do you have that one?
I don't have that one.
Oh, okay. The way it was presented on in the public space, but then the response in the public space, I think, was quite different.
Yeah. Should I say something to it?
Yeah, sure. Sure. That was the opening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the format is a lot like this. Like this one back there, Ben, where it's yeast based. It was drawn in my sketchbook, and then I blew them up, and then I printed them on bond paper, like probably at my office or at hot off the press, and then I kind of painstakingly glue them together and then choose a particular day or a particular night to do it. Simply because I wanted to kind of like be a surprise. So what happens that this is just yeast-based paper, laser print, kind of jet print. And it's just with a team of, I think I did Hope Road with a team of 3 or 4 people. And it didn't take too long. It was, I measure the wall, it takes a little while, and then I choose a particular night when I know either, there wouldn't be a lot of presence, police presence. I did get kind of pinned up by the police, but it wasn't serious, simply because I knew that, they haven't really observed kind of like street art or that kind of stuff in progress often. And so there's this kind of loopholes that I kind of took advantage of. No, they're like, it's a culture of like using paint and stuff like that, but it's just, I think the act itself was to kind of bring awareness of a public space, and to kind of use public space to talk about stuff that happens in public often, but no one really wants to kind of deal with it. It was, I think for me, it was just an exercise of sharing, and yeah, it kind of backfired on me in a way, because then the news kind of brought it on and they were talking about, they kind of skipped over it became more sensational, I think. And for me, that was kind of like the lowest point of it. But, lots of positive reviews too. I think a lot of people wanted to see more stuff like that around the city, around Kingston. It's just, it's very underutilized as it relates to art in public space here.
Well, I agree. I think that I think people are unused to seeing something that is thought-provoking in their day-to-day space. It's easy to get through your the daily trod, so to speak, because you're seeing the same things you normally see, and then of course they come up on this now that makes them stop. It's like, what is it? Why is it there? Who put it there? Something about that looks familiar, but something about it looks very, very, very strange. And I mean, I actually want to kind of lead into the fact that you've been using historical representations of Black female bodies, but then you have juxtaposed them with your avatar, so to speak. And your avatar is very contemporary and very provocative. So why, with these almost revered figures, you've put them to the left and then this figure to the right. Why were you joining those two in the conversation?
Well, I think for me, searching for, understanding of self and kind of like looking through documentations of what our past used to look like, I realized a lot of these images weren't created by us. Like, they were created by whosoever was in power at the time, most likely white European. Duperley and Sons, I think this where I took these females from, they had them perfectly lined up. It was kind of like talking about how well behaved we were at that time, and
construction.
It was a construction. And I thought, the character
identity.
will definitely represents a disruption in that, kind of talking about the present day female in terms of occupying the dancehall space. Them being there is disruptive in everything that these women in the past would be. And I thought just kind of having that dialogue would kind of create more cracks in terms of what really happens through those lenses versus what's happening now, how people see themselves now.
Oh no, I was just saying that for me, it's interesting that we have the colonial era space where the black female identity is constructed more dominantly. It's not the word I want to use. from an outside perspective. Whereas you have the dancehall space, which is often spoken of as being a space where identity is constructed by the individual within the space, even though I know that there are some criticisms that you have about that identity and its construction, but it's very interesting, almost like being self-actualization as opposed to representation by the other, and
Exactly.
being othered as
Mhm.
well. So it's like these two things coming together. I've often found the way you've done these juxtapositions to be very interesting in a way to address and redress history.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, if you want to even just look at like, I don't really particularly pay attention to dress, but the women that I saw in these images, they kind of looked a lot of like what kind of like Miss Lou would kind of dress like, a kind of long dresses that, meet to the ankle, wearing of bandanas. And that, it's not far history. Like my grandmother who died, I think in 2007 or 8, dressed like that, and she used to cut cane for a living. And it's just, you know, and then thinking about the 90s, what happened in dancehall and how that didn't become like a kind of touristic representation. Like it wasn't sellable. These kind of notions in terms of like what were we thinking in terms of how we present ourselves or how we present ourselves to the world was kind of like stitched in here somewhere, and of course it's also just kind of then how it's passed on from this picture that was kind of taken way back in, like early 19th century when the camera just was invented. So just kind of like a perpetuation in terms of like how we are consumed outside of the country. There's like a preoccupation in that. And then of course, the dualities of like how we consider ourselves now. I think like things like that are kind of like where I'd like to suss out through just by, creating these kind of works back in the day.
It's interesting though that you also mentioned, in terms of clothing, because for me, the clothing that you've mentioned, the clothing that's represented here is a decidedly colonial way of moderating sexuality.
Yeah.
It's a way of moderating the body. It's covering the body as much as possible to almost control in a way that would have been different from our ancestors, if they back in West Africa, how they would have dressed, how they would have seen, the way they would have considered their own bodies,
Right.
and the way that their bodies would have been interpreted by them, by those around them. And it's all, as I say, it for me, the aspect of dress is quite interesting when you think about how we have so internalized those British colonial mentalities surrounding dress and propriety, that when we see, the body exposed in particular ways in a dance hall space, middle class Jamaicans are affronted. It's like, this is vulgar. This is something that, is, part of the lowest common denominator of humanity. It's not how we want to see ourselves. And, self-respecting Black people should not present themselves in this way. So I actually like the fact that you are challenging, you're exploring it as well. You're looking at the problematics, but you're also challenging those two perspectives within a work like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and besides that, there's also the labor. How does one kind of find purpose?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like the next thing, having these bananas on their heads, and like, the characters kind of just kind of flipping that concept on its head. Instead of carrying it on its head, it's carrying it on its ass, kind of like play with this supposedly work oriented object. Yeah, I mean, that's just another.
But how much has your exploration of dancehall, you feel, influenced your work? Because the dancehall aesthetic and reality is never too far away. How has that influenced your work, particularly as an artist dealing with not just sexuality, but queer sexualities in this space? That's like a two-part question. So don't worry.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird because like I thought for me, what was interesting about dancehall was just how much it was kind of dismissed as not a representation of us. And I think that this was just like my discovery coming to art school, in the early 2000s, just like how much the students there didn't really care so much about it because they were looking outside. They were looking at like alternative culture. And I think for me it was just then you know, is there a way to kind of like use this thing that is distinctively us to kind of have a dialogue in art, in visual culture, right? Visually. I mean, I think, you know, I think I've mentioned in a couple of interviews before that Vibes Cartel was kind of like a breaking point, kind of understanding human using language and thinking about poetry in that way became, you know, these play on words were kind of like the key to how I would then construct some of these, you know, images or these concepts. You know, I was doing just, I thought I was just doing it because nobody else was doing it. And you know, it gave me a lot of joy at that time too, because it kind of given me a direct contact with an audience that I felt I couldn't be a part of now if I was myself. And that is why I like, you know, I kind of think about dancehall in opposites. You know, I think about kind of like the use of the neon colors. I kind of think about, the idea of bodies gathering and kind of doing ridiculous things, the abuse that's probably involved in it, you know, how it's kind of measured as it relates to what is masculine and what is feminine, like how, you know, how easily can be misconstrued just through dress or just through body language. Like those things are kind of like what I find to be very quite interesting, and kind of like thinking about queerness and thinking about performance in that way, how people go out and present themselves in the street versus how people present themselves at home, you know, when they are their true selves. And even then questioning, you know, what is Jamaican if it's this scale that keeps on changing as trends do. Because, you know, like the interesting thermometer with thinking about dancehall is how much generation by generation it shifts, right? And you know what then are interesting and what then are trends and so like even for like I think the reason why I've kind of shifted over into the way I'm painting now is because I realize it's kind of futile, and you know probably I need to spend more time thinking about myself than to kind of thinking about dancehall, like being a participant in that art, thinking about how that then becomes this proxy to how I feel about myself and being back home in Jamaica. But it's just still, you know, I still use a lot of the vernaculars. I still use a lot of the icons, like using the heel and using, you know, the heels and using the character in a way, in its distortions through choreography, probably. Thinking about, you know, probably, you know, language, like some of the works I title using like dancehall names and stuff like that. Probably should go to the next. Yeah, I mean, I think this one is kind of like very literal in that sense, where I use like these vintage dancehall records to kind of dissect the characters, and then have the characters kind of reveal or use the record to kind of reveal or kind of hide things about the characters. And it's kind of sequential, so it's like 5 characters that kind of seem to dance. But I think this was kind of like that point of departure. And I think this, to me, this was also like the heights in which I think I could push the character publicly, talking about the subject matter that I'm interested in, and kind of not hiding it behind some other kind of joke or some kind of trick.
I think that's very interesting. I mean, particularly for these works, because you mentioned the whole kind of Marilyn Monroe skirt blowing up exposure thing earlier, and of course, this was the work that we were both thinking about when you said it, How to Kill a Sound Boy. Yeah. But it's also the way you talk about the vintage dance hall records, kind of bisecting, they're cutting. It's there's almost a violence.
Yeah.
To how they're cutting through the figure. And of course, you have that dialogue between the masculine presentation and the feminine presentation there within the same figure. So it's almost like it's cutting through both representations of sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, and of course, the term "how to kill a soundboy" that
Yeah.
is very important within that, within the dance hall space in terms of how the musical clashes
Yeah.
happen. And of course, either you're killing a soundboy by defeating his sound. It's almost like the sound itself now seems to be killing people within within the dance hall context and within the dance hall space, because it's cutting through a segment of people,
Right.
or a
Right.
space of people. But
Right.
the thing for me though is that we're talking about your work and your work evolving, and that's something that and how the figure has evolved, because the figure has become more provocative almost. I think the 3D representation for me, it gives it a particular kind of presence to the viewer. But then you start to, in your more recent work, you've started to kind of evolve. Well, it could have gone to the previous one, but the figure began to get even more abstracted
Right.
than before, and it's become almost indiscernible from the elements that inform the identity of the figure, the bike, the gold chain, and so on. And it feels like there's a little bit of I'll call it, if evolution, I said, but then also a devolution, kind of a like the figure is beginning. And I saw it in some of the later work that's in the next slide, but it's a thing where the figure is beginning to be, it's almost imploding in a way. So tell me why you decided to go on that track
I think
with
mainly
the
because,
figure. Mm-hmm.
yeah, sorry. I think when I created this body of work, I was really trying to find a way to activate material. I wanted to think about what working with oil paint would be like, and how I would represent that, how I would work that into my work. Like, how can I get back into painterliness of it? And I wanted to make the character even more complex. I wanted to kind of talk about subjects or topics that were directly attached to me and my body in per se. So when I started thinking about portraiture, I was thinking about then, okay, masculinity. How can I kind of use the space of this silhouette of this character to have a broader discussion about my own kind of lineage, my own kind of direct connections. I think when I did this one in particular, I was thinking about the bike itself, the yang yang being this kind of way of kind of getting around, but more than just kind of getting around, but more like a ticket out of poverty, if you want to say in that way. I don't know how to ride a motorcycle because I didn't have to, but my dad, taught me about his kind of stories. And I don't know if anybody has ever watched this film. I can't remember its name. But there's several kind of, if you want to think about Jimmy Cliff, probably From How Do They Come? There's this kind of relationship between masculinity, him being a man and being able to be mobile. And then how is that then connected to his own hustle? And I think now it's kind of like then turned up into, it's kind of maximizing a particular where there's more men doing it, especially because of crime, they're kind of using it as a way to get around kind of carrying messages or drugs or scamming, to become this menace. But for me to kind of become a kind of like a reference to the male body in a particular way, especially a particular male, and how they've kind of navigated that space. But then I was just kind of thinking about, okay, how do I dig myself out of a situation where I'm not a byproduct of, sugarcane growing? I think that's kind of like the first step in terms of trying to be more than that. And, you know, it starts by being mobile, being away from the fields, finding a way to kind of like distinguish yourself from these tropes, this historical kind of trap. And, you know, it comes on, I realize on a Black body, it's important to have embellishment. You know, the idea of wearing a chain, you know, thinking about kind of dookie chains, kind of like what represented during rap or, you know, early 80s, wearing a Kangol hats, you know, it's all about a kind of presentation, you know, the Adidas jumpsuits. Like it's, for me, it's just kind of like using these things as props to kind of construct. And so the work kind of become a metaphor, this kind of construction. But then of course it had to, the character itself got sacrificed. It had to collapse under almost all these kind of, these things that are added on. But you know, it was just kind of like, I took, the act was just taking all these images and then drawing them and stenciling them and then kind of cover it entirely in oil and then removing the stencil. And then what's left is kind of like, you know, I guess probably a clear cut, probably a very less clear distinction between these elements of, you know, chains and clothing and bikes and sugarcane.
It's almost like you're looking in between the spaces of the things that you're used to seeing. So you're forced to think about what's not there and
Right.
what you're not seeing and what's not evident.
Yeah.
But in the next in the next slide that you have, I mean, this is definitely a return to a more painterly kind of aesthetic, but the figure itself has, I will say, become almost unrecognizable in that if you're used to, if you've seen the evolution, if you've seen the different works to this point, you'll note, you'll almost recognize the silhouette, you'll almost recognize particular elements, you know, maybe a line here that resembles a mouth or a jaw or so on. But then you have this almost explosion of color and almost this botanical feel. You can feel, it's like you're feeling the history, you're feeling the sugarcane more so than actually seeing it as an identifiable element. What brought you to this point?
I think more than anything else, I was trying to find an innovative way of returning to the material of color, because it's spending some time kind of like asking myself outside of Jamaica that I wanted to find out what these things meant, and you know, and it's just like things I would present for critique, I would always get a location. They were like, oh, these colors remind me of the Caribbean, you know, they remind me of the sea, and it kind of annoyed me. And I think it, you know, I mean, some of these are kind of like, and I mean, I think these are just a simplification of trying to locate a technique and the use of a material. So I wasn't really too specific on color. I was using distemper here, and I was using watercolors, and you know, I would still see if I could throw in my neon colors. And so what happens is that there's like these layers of kind of burying shapes and colors and then layering. I think at least 3 or 4 layers of information was kind of embedded in the work. And then I was thinking about how then is it a way of kind of creating a kind of abstraction, you know. I used to call it a pintamento in terms of painting and then starting over, and then you know, but then you know, it became kind of like the materials kind of like some are blurring into each other because wet on wet, you know, things will kind of blur into each other, and then some things get preserved still kind of graphic, so some of the sharp edge from the stencils, and you know, it was kind of like there was something in it, and I needed to find a way to kind of like peer back, but I kind of just did this to test to see how well and how the materials react with each other, you know, how do I work? Because what happens is that everything is kind of chaotic, you know, the paint's not really 100% controlled. The only thing that's controlled there is the stenciling and some of the charcoal. So the blacks use is drawing. So I'm drawing on top of the canvas. And using then the charcoal to negotiate where paint is. So it also becomes a kind of way of masking, you know, what's kind of, and of course, color mixing, because, you know, gray tones over a certain color gives you a kind of color in between. So like I'm asking myself a lot of questions, especially throughout the series. Jawbone is the one that's being showed here, but I thought if I had others to kind of like show, you know, probably the story will become a little bit clearer, that this is also a kind of like precursor to the motorbike series, the series that I had done before the portraits, because it's an emergence. It's almost like a transcendence. It's like material and ideologies and you know, questions and objects, iconographies that I've used before, kind of mashing into it, kind of collapsing on the character itself, like breaking it down into just something much more open and much more inclusive for myself as an artist. I think you know, there is less calculation, and I think that for me is a point of ease where I don't have to kind of have a precognitive kind of like idea of what this image or this painting is going to become or what it looks like when it's finished. I kind of allow the process and the materials to kind of take over. Yeah.
There are two things that I'm actually going to kind of hitch my question on. Two things that you just said are a series of words. There is one in terms of the color. One thing you said about the work, the character, the personality, kind of collapsing into itself, but then you use the phrase transcendence. Yeah. And you also talk about it being a much more open representation. So how much of you and your concept of yourself, your perception of yourself, unmoderated or even influenced by society, is in this? How much of your own sense of self, sense of sexuality, identity is taken up in this work?
Okay. Well, I mean, more than anything else, my practice have always kind of been a kind of tool that I use to develop myself. Like, kind of, I try to, every time I do it or I push myself through it, I'm trying to like fulfill some potential, like, and it's also kind of like a revisiting, because my father would train me painting using watercolors, and I've resisted that throughout probably most of my career, simply because I was just trying to find my own path, because he's an artist, and I'm trying to find my own language within that. But then, you know, there's also the idea that I don't have an audience to perform for anymore. You know, I think when I was, you know, I developed most of this stuff while I was studying at SAIC, and there wasn't an audience I could be very calculative of in terms of reaction when they saw my work. You know, I didn't have the local audience that I grew up with here. And so what happens with that, I felt like there was a kind of catching up. I had to catch up with myself, because I've spent so much time to kind of like take eyes off me in a particular way, like especially it's to like sexuality, and kind of not trying to stand out. And when I went, you know, when I was there, then it only stood out that I was Black. And then, you know, a lot of people didn't know I was gay, because I didn't fit the kind of present representations of what these things around gayness or queerness is supposed to look like. You know, I kind of consider myself to be a very kind of local Jamaican guy, and simple in how he presents himself. But, you know, of course, you know, that in itself is probably problematic. But the idea for me is that I didn't feel like I needed to entertain or kind of fit in that space. And so what I was more interested in is just the awareness in terms of what art could be. So even the move into looking at abstraction, I was thinking about why didn't I see that much abstraction back home? I was thinking about, just how comes why do we lean into the academy so much? Like, why do we need to present the figure and represent I mean, there's a lot of it now, and I get the space in history where, art, where that particular work fits in, it being, figurative works and representation. But I've also kind of then been considering myself, why can't we be easily accepted for a thinker, for thinkers, for people who, why is the space so limited for conceptualists, for abstraction? Like, Frank Bowling was someone I discovered. And it could also be because of my education, right? I studied graphic design. So when I did my BFA, it wasn't in painting. And so like, there was this kind of great sense of like, thinking about of tooling, how do I use the tools that were meant and not meant for me to kind of create or continue or evolve on a trajectory that I already started. And I think that gave me a lot of fulfillment, especially when it comes down to, thinking about material, but then using material against itself to kind of make itself, so like the ripping off and like the taking off or the scraping or, the covering with charcoal. Like it's still another approach to painting, but one that I'm not seeing that much of. And I thought, okay, probably there's an opportunity here. There's something here to explore as it relates to the character. So I kind of then take the technique and wherever it meets in between the characters, it forms something new. And for me, that newness gives me great pleasure and relief and a sense of purpose and a sense of self, a sense of invention. And I think in itself, what the painting reveals itself is a kind of transcendence. It's beyond anything that I had thought of, or it's beyond what the materials were kind of meant to do. And it just becomes a point of wonder. And I think that gives me great pleasure. Especially because now, like the kind of space in which Black art occupies, I just thought it's just a good space to be in.
So you're this sense of self, and thank you, by the way, because that you kind of killed a couple of my questions with that, which is very convenient. But in terms of this sense of self that you or that kind of freeing, I don't want the term cathartic art is so hackneyed, but it is almost a bit of a catharsis. It's a little bit of a kind of it almost seems that this work is in fact quite cathartic in terms of your process, your being, your personal evolution. I wonder though, in terms of, I mean, I don't think you have a slide of this, but the performance piece that you did, Mother Makes Man.
Yeah.
Because for me, when you did that work, it was almost like a definitive insertion into the work. It's almost like you were literally the work, presenting it in real time in the space. Now, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. And it's interesting that we also have this slide up because I remember writing a small description about Man Standing in Cane Field, and it kind of emerged from an experience that I had that's really connected to the performance too. So because of where I live in Westmoreland, there's the Georges Plain, which is very close, and which is a huge kind of flat, arid space that's made for sugarcane growing, and sugarcane still grows there. But during the reaping season, they'll catch it at fire. Like it'll be ablaze and the soot comes up in the air and it falls. And I thought, oh, here is carbon, here is charcoal. And it falls, and then if you had washed or done laundry and it touches it, it turns black. My grandmother used to work in one of these cane fields, and she's a very dark lady, and it's kind of just part of the condition with working, cutting in soot that you would eventually get covered in it. And she would wear a skirt similar to what I had made for the performance. So that skirt was kind of like not just a symbol of like femininity, but a symbol of strength and endurance. But of course, then, the idea is then adorning her clothing and not, say a man's clothing. That kind of finding strength in the feminine, because I think more than anything else here, in this kind of society that we live in, we tend to kind of, I don't know, exalt masculinity. And, I think for me, that says a lot about gayness and queerness too, because it's talking about if you're feminine, then it means that. And I don't consider myself to be feminine, but if I'm trying to like break ground in terms of an understanding, then my own understanding needs to be challenged. And that was kind of like the purpose of it. How do you define strength? And yes, there's strength in femininity. Yes, there's strength in a skirt. And it's not about like, especially now when there's like, RuPaul Drag Race, when of course people are dressed up and it's all fun and stuff. But what I'm talking about is the feminine that was grounded in a particular history, slavery, that labor, and building the reconstruction of self from the soot, from the burning earth. Kind of like, for me, there's lots of strength and power within that. My grandmother reared, like, she had, I don't say her, but she had many kids, and of course it's something she had to do on her own. And for me, it was just kind of like to commemorate that journey, and of course marry with the material that I had chosen to work with in my paintings.
Okay. I could continue, as we've had multiple conversations around your work, but there are two questions that came in the Q&A, and I think I should give them the space now. Does, in terms of this particular series, the one that's on screen right now, does it also have any echoes of the Junkanoo tradition in Jamaica? There is this interesting performative aspect to the imagery, almost carnivalesque. Yeah. So do you feel there's a connection with I mean, it's right after Christmas now. It's an interesting time to be asking that question.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that in truth, I wasn't very happy with most of the colors in this. And it's not because it feels very kind of carnivalesque and decorative. It's also because I wanted to find something that was unfamiliar. So it's not on purpose. I mean, I guess you can read it in that way, where it has this kind of flurry, this kind of action. It's evident in what's there, but it's not like, wasn't my intent. Yeah.
So not directly connected to Junkanoo, even though I can see how someone might interpret that. The next question is something is surrounding mental health. Is mental health an inspiration for your art? Do you express any of your personal experience with mental health within your artwork?
I mean, in some ways there's a kind of madness, and there's a kind of energy of something being out of control or contained. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm thinking about mental illness, because I wouldn't consider myself to be someone who was directly affected by that, but I am aware and very, very much an advocate for, self-assessment, evaluation and thinking about the mind and the health of the mind, of course. I think for me, there's this weird thin line that we traverse here in the Caribbean that, you know, there's a kind of like brilliance and madness. And I think it's just simply because of how we have to navigate the kind of psychic energy it takes for us to kind of navigate a space of, I wouldn't even say a space, I would say navigating a void, a place of nothingness. And you know, it can consume you mentally. I think probably if there's any metaphor that's in any of my portraits, it's about that. But of course, I just kind of call it an interiority, because that interiority could also be kind of like a place of peace, and it can also be a place of madness. But it's kind of like the person thinking about themselves.
But I wonder though, because the conversation I feel that we have been having in Jamaica specifically, we've been having very stilted conversations surrounding mental health. And there's often a confusion between the conversation around mental health and the conversations around mental illness, and then also the stigmatization of both. Where I think that in terms of, I mean, one of the things that I have been kind of teasing out as I've been asking you particular questions was where you were within yourself and where you were with relationship to the work that you are producing. And you've answered those questions, but I find it a very, very interesting that came up in the Q&A, because it is something that, in terms of having to deal with homophobia, in terms of having to deal with it in a culture that you can both love and hate at the same time, which is Jamaica at its best and at its worst for queer artists, queer people, anyone who is not part is not, you know, perpetuating this kind of binary representation of people. But I think I think that it is something that I find to be one of the more or the most engaging aspects of your work, that kind of internalized the internal aspect of the work that is, it's not below the surface, it's right there for you to see, but it's still a representation of what's within. We have a very interesting, a totally different kind of question now coming in. So what high school did you go to, Leasho? What high school did you go to before you went to Edna Manley? What school did you attend?
I went to Green Island High School. I mean, back then it was Green Island Comprehensive up till 2000 when I graduated.
Okay. I'm going to piggyback slightly on that though, because I know that your father was a major influence in terms of your artistic journey. What were there any high school teachers that also influenced you?
I wouldn't say in the same way. There are people who were encouraging, but I think for me, I'm still kind of sore about the idea that, I had to drop it halfway through my 4 years at high school, because it's as a subject, it just kind of got thrown out. So it wasn't something that was even, I think, as I said, I kind of struggled with valuing what I was doing for a long while, because it didn't seem as if it was important. Kind of like a waste talent in some way. I mean, these are just how I kind of internalized it for a while. But I know that, because, it's something I enjoyed so much, and, I was encouraged, I was in the right space to kind of continue doing it. It didn't really matter that much.
Okay. All right. I don't think there are any more questions. Okay, my bad. Okay. Are you seeing the question?
No.
Oh, okay. There is like, do you want to talk about mansplaining? Yeah, I'm not sure. Not quite sure.
No.
If we've discussed, I mean, if we've discussed that as a concept related to your work,
of mansplaining. I mean, I know what it is.
Yeah, me too. Is I'm not actually trying to figure out how it fit in.
That's something I think about.
Yes, yeah, it's something to think about. There's one viewer who would have loved to see some of your father's work.
Yeah.
And is very pleased to know that his influence is evident within your work, even if it's as a counterbalance, I guess, so to speak. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, I really wish that he would continue painting. My dad stopped painting for a while.
Yeah, I wish my father would continue sculpting too. I think we're both, yeah, I don't know, maybe we both need to figure out how we're going to convince our parents to take back to take back their artistic identities. Yeah. Do you think that you that you have started to find your purpose while making art? Do you think you have found your style?
I think I found my voice, like that I find to be more encompassing. I found my voice. I find, yeah, my voice, really.
Okay. I think that's a very fair and complete statement. Yeah. All right, we are coming down to what is we've passed the 1 hour mark. So if there are no more questions, I've been tasked with saying thank you to everyone for joining us for this very, very interesting talk. I will say it's a continuation when I hope to keep having with Leasho as his work continues to evolve. I'd like to thank the team at the AGO for making this possible. I'd like to thank Julie, Kathleen, Fraser, and Annie for being the organizers, the support, everything that made this very possible. And yes, I hope that everyone will come back to see it when it has been properly transcribed and on and on the AGO's YouTube and website. So as I said, if there's nothing else, everybody is very happy. By the way, Leasho, with your talk, and I'd like to thank you, Leasho, for being the artist who created this work and for continuing what I consider to be very necessary conversations around queer realities in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, because your work is, for me, a vital way of combating the erasure that has happened within our society. And I'm glad that you're able to show. I'm glad that the audience in Toronto can see, well, not right now, but has seen and will hopefully soon see the work again within a context that will showcase how it has come into being, what the influences are, and what the future can hold for these kind of dialogues. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leasho.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
All right.